Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know we're waiting for one other panelist, but because we were limited on time, we want to have a great conversation. We'll go ahead and get started, and when he gets here, we'll let him do his introduction, and then we'll keep going with the questions. My name is Ashley Rogers. I am a health equity strategist that's worked for Fortune 500 companies. And I have my own company called Sparkles and Rogers. I'll go ahead and let the other panelists introduce themselves. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Tamara Duperval-Brownlee. I go by Tam, and I serve as the Chief Health Officer for Accenture. I'm a family physician by background, and essentially my role is to wake up every day and thinking about our 750,000 employees across the globe and their families, and create health and well-being strategies so that they can thrive personally and professionally, as well as our clients.
Awesome. My name is Rachel. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending our panel. I am the Division Vice President of Trust and Safety at TaskUs. By trade, I'm a psychotherapist with a background in trauma recovery. I've been working in more traditional social work settings for most of my career and profession, and now I'm responsible for the health and well-being of our 50,000 plus employees in a global network across about 12 different countries. So happy to be here with you guys today and have a robust conversation about DEI.
Perfect. Well, I'll go ahead and get started with the title of our panel. Yes, E should be included in DEI. So why do you feel like it's essential for E to not only be included, but emphasized in diversity and equity inclusion strategies?
Well, I'll go ahead and get started. I think it's important to include because fundamentally, I think the simple answer is that people are demanding it. I think especially as they come into the workplace, and I'm going to just take the lens of workers and the role of employers in that. Increasingly, as employees are coming in the workplace, especially younger generations, they are looking for simple things. They're wanting to be at an employer whereby they can live purpose, they can be seen, they can be safe, and that they can thrive. And equity, I think, having a lens of equity, I think, as you recruit, onboard, bring people along in an organization, allow them to progress and mature and develop in their skills, requires, I think, a lens of equity. It is, I think at its purest form, it really invites everybody in, to the table and the conversation. And there is a miss if I think employers do not take a lens of equity, because you may miss, I think, valuable skills, valuable, I think, thoughts, valuable presence of people in the workplace if it's not considered, or if you only take a two-dimensional look of who a person is, say, on paper.
I'm just going to break it into some simplistic terms that help me kind of imagine what that means. So if we talk about diversity, it's just representation. We have a representation of different people at the table. Inclusion, right, is participation. But if we ignore equity, we're ignoring the systemic structural components that limit people from full participation. So looking at that holistically as companies and corporations to reimagine what kind of the structural components that are in place at your organizations that inadvertently disenfranchise people from full participation is why equity, I think, is so important. So.
Yeah, I also think with equity, what's important to think of is that it's really about giving those additional resources, right, to remove those barriers. It could be systemic, social, economic, and otherwise. I think the reality is that what many organizations have to do is reclaim what does equity truly mean to them, because of all of the negative and false rhetoric, the assumptions that are made, redistributing resources and assets and given to others is completely not it. But if you don't have those equitable practices that organizations have practiced for so long, well, how do you ensure that employees, that all of your multidimensional employees are able to reach their full potential, able to succeed? So really having that focus and that emphasis on equity pulls in embracing those diverse skill sets and perspectives, as well as creating that true sense of belonging.
Those are all really good questions. I do have a follow-up for that. Since you all have all been working in DEI for a very long time, what are some of the major challenges that you've experienced working in the space, especially in corporate America, where currently it's being weaponized, and there's a lot of, contentious thoughts about that. What are some of the challenges, and how have you solved for those?
I'll give a perspective from healthcare. Prior to being at Accenture, I worked in healthcare delivery for nearly 20 years, and one of, I think, my most challenging but rewarding roles was working for a large national healthcare system that didn't have the language of health equity before I got there, but was very interested in wanting to demonstrate the high quality that they were delivering to care for patients all throughout the country. And I think if it wasn't until we talked about what equity actually was, to I think rightfully see patients for who they were, not just a two-dimensional demographic, on a piece of paper, without assigning, I think, their outcomes to perhaps a negative behavior. And you hear it all the time, when it comes to care. Oh, I wish Mr. Smith, he's non-compliant, he's XYZ. But until you take an equitable look and see that Mr. Smith actually lives in a food desert, a healthcare desert, a, name your thing, desert. He comes from a long line of generational poverty. He has been denied access to appropriate education, healthcare resources, et cetera, that it's not non-compliance, it's really lack of access and opportunity or education that it makes a big difference. I'll give a brief example. When I first got to the previous organization I was at, I took on a project of improving breast cancer rates. Nothing controversial in that. Everybody wants to see women thrive and not fall victim to breast cancer. And our rates were abysmal, largely reporting, but we were just not doing well. So we set a goal, let's just be the national average. Woo, nothing too exciting there. So we did the work and we empowered everyone from front desk registration staff to providers, clinicians, everybody get breast cancer rates up, and we did it. It was really wonderful, and we targeted largely those who were covered by commercial insurance, that plan that you probably have right now, and we were all patting ourselves on the back. And then I said, who are these women that we're impacting, though? Let's just take a closer look. And when we stratified, at the time we didn't have the opportunity to look at race, ethnicity, at the like. We just did, how about Medicaid, versus commercial insurance? And our eyes were agape. There was at least a 20-point difference in percentages of breast cancer screening rates. And it took everybody by the hand. I did this demonstration of lining up 10 women on the stage, and I said, in our efforts, we protected, probably 8 women out of 10 by getting breast cancer rate screening early, but we left 4 of them behind because they were covered by Medicaid. How do we feel about that? And it really opened everybody's eyes to this, notion, like, especially clinicians, I treat everybody the same, Dr. Tam, and that's the problem, and equity allows you to be able to see that if we're not taking a closer look, if we're not looking at the factors that impacts a person's, ability to live their best life, to have the best access to being healthy and well, then we leave people behind, and that's what equity does. And you can imagine that if you're thinking about a company that's wanting to deliver the best innovations, the best technologies and everything, if you don't have a lens of equity of your talent, you may be missing out on that opportunity to have the next greatest thing, that's out there. Perhaps it's the engineer who is also neurodiverse, maybe he doesn't do great in group settings, but is a brilliant person. How do we bring that person to the front and leverage their talents forward? The challenge is getting there. How do you introduce that? And I think in the example, the quality issue, it's a powerful visual image. Everybody cares, about, wanting to prevent cancer. Everybody wants to do the right thing and have good quality metrics, but when you show it, I think from that lens of equity, it makes an impact.
Do you want us to?
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the 2 things that I see that are challenges in a corporate setting is, one, that there's been this shift to, does DEI mean favoritism? Versus the realization that when everybody's doing well, we all do well. And that includes business metrics. Businesses thrive when they have happy, satisfied employees that feel cared for and prioritized in whatever way that looks like. The other thing that I see is potentially problematic in a corporate setting is the rampant nature of tokenism around DEI, right? So we're gonna celebrate this 1 month, or we're gonna do this one training, and that's all we're gonna do. And they're not really creating coalitions that are really embedded into the systems of a business to make sure that all elements of that business are helping elevate their employee base to be as productive, happy, and well as they can be. And at the end of the day, if we do those things, business is actually going to benefit as well. So those would be the two things that I see are challenges.
That's great.
Yeah, I would just kind of piggyback and say I think one of the first things you have to do is understand why those inequities exist, right? Because you can't really focus to solve those inequities if you don't understand why they exist. Why are the mortality rates so high of women of color? You know, just like you talked about the breast cancer screening, you know, we recognize that we're biased and those stereotypes come into play. I think more so in the corporate setting, one of the biggest challenges that I see is that unfortunately we have a lot of great business leaders, very intelligent leaders who unfortunately haven't done the research themselves, right? They've been dictated to what equity means and what it does not. And they're making these assumptions, and just based upon that, they're not really putting emphasis and say, hey, the safe thing for us to do would be to do nothing at all. I think organizations should take that holistic approach of all identities, not focus specifically on just one, but thinking about all of those different dimensions, those neurodiversity, LGBTQ plus, veterans, and all those different identities that make up our organizations, and creating practices, policies that really helps all to succeed. And you know, I'll give you a perfect example. Right now, we're working with a large architecture firm, and they're setting up their first resource groups. And there's a healthy debate on should those resource groups be exclusive. And you have to identify it this way to participate. And the reality is we need to bring those allies to the table. The only way we're going to make change is with allies. And instead of us, we can't have inclusion if we're intentionally excluding individuals as well.
I love that you brought up allies, because there's that conversation about allies and being a co-conspirator. In my opinion, you all need to be co-conspirators. It's okay to be out, you know, a little bit uncomfortable to fight the good fight. So, with that said, in what ways can someone in a position of power and/or privilege, and I say privilege not just by race, it's also sexual orientation, gender, being able-bodied, neurotypical, that also comes with privilege, how they can move from allyship to be a co-conspirator in DEI efforts. Because I think a lot of times right now there's a lot of performative acts where people are, like when Black Lives Matter happened, people were putting the black square, or like, you know, a hashtag here and a hashtag there, but they're not actually doing anything when it actually makes a difference and especially at work. So how can someone be an ally? How can somebody be a co-conspirator instead of an ally?
Yeah, I think to your point, the difference between showing up at a rally versus ground organizing a rally, right? Those would be an example of like, how do you ally versus how do you co-conspirate? And I think co-conspirating means that you have to be willing to take some risks with negative implications to leverage your privilege to help make a difference. Maybe that's advocating up your chain of command or to your C-suite or your board or whatever that looks like for systemic policy changes or differences, or ERG groups, you know, the establishment of those types of things. How do you help organize and leverage your privilege in a way that may feel unsafe to some people sometimes? But I think it helps put us in a position of some of the other folks that are equally as struggling and don't have the luxury all the time of feeling like they can be safe advocating for themselves. And to your point, there's, you know, a lot of intersectionalities that go into that, so it's complicated. I'm not suggesting that it's simplistic and distilled into, as you mentioned, just racial terms or anything like that. But where can you kind of be introspective, identify your own privilege, and how can you leverage that privilege to create space and a voice and take risks in your company to do the right thing?
I was just I love that you said that you have to be brave, right? And you have to be willing to be vulnerable. And I think one of the most important things to recognize is that, you know, when I see a lot of DE&I efforts that failed, it's been because we were responding to something. There was a lot of employees say, oh, we're being more intentional with DE&I. What happened? Did we get sued? Where's there an incident? Organizations that are truly authentic and intentional have more sustainable acts. And I also think that it's really important to recognize the fact that being an ally isn't self-appointed, right? We're really chosen as allies by those relationships that we develop, our actions, our behaviors, and it is something that happens over time as well. So I think just really being intentional in how we engage and really connect with those that are around us is really moves us from being an ally to really a co-conspirator, which is action oriented and has to show up consistently.
Those are all really good answers. So this is a little bit more controversial, but I think it's important for us to talk about that. All of us, I know, we probably have the elephant in the room, no pun intended. Like, we're all just trying to recover from last night, from the election, regardless of how you voted. With that said, I do have questions regarding the new administration that's coming in and how that can possibly affect DEI in the workplace. So my question is, how might changes in federal policy impact DEI efforts, especially in the areas like workplace equity, training, and anti-discrimination measures?
Well, I know for me, first and foremost, I'm going to miss all of the calls and text messages. My phone has never been as active as it has over the last couple of months. But I think we've already seen a lot of those, a lot of the impacts over the last couple of years. I'm sorry, the last couple of 18 months or 2 years, really in the public sector, those that have federal and state funding. And I think regardless of how the election turned out, that was going to continue. But I also think that when we work with many organizations in different states that have had this anti-legislation, and when we sit down, we really read and look at what the legislation is banning, it's not often the concepts that really support an authentic DE&I initiative. And I think one of the challenges is we flashpoint a lot of these things that divide us, and we assume that is what DE&I is, and that's what's leading to a lot of organizations saying, hey, we have to turn away from these efforts, or we can't support this. And so I think, again, really, having good communication, understanding what DE&I is and what it is not, and it is not tokenism, and it is not excluding or creating those unfair advantages. But we all know that the social setting influences a lot, and unfortunately, that's what's really driving a lot of the negative narrative, which is going to be really daunting and challenging to overcome.
Yeah, I agree.
I feel like the work will still need to continue. I think what the opportunity, I always think about it like, well, what's the opportunity, given the momentum, as Gary described, over the past couple of years. I feel like it's a renaming and a reframing. I do feel like that there is a underlying desire, I think, for more understanding. I think more wanting to come together than would belie us. I think in the public language, but some language is triggering. So I feel like if we get to the base of what we're really trying to accomplish, the work can continue, but it requires us as conspirators and co-conspirators to be really crafty, in terms of how we're able to get that done. I think about the work that's being done in Accenture. We've had some very public I&D goals, especially in the space of gender parity, for which we've come under a lot of public scrutiny, but it's really opened the eyes, I think, of a lot of people to really understand why it's important. And really unlock potential and talent within the organization that hadn't been realized before. And I'm proud that our CEO is in a place, as a woman, saying we are not going to back down. We're going to keep moving forward with our initiatives. And it's hard to argue with what the first number one or number two most powerful woman in the world, according to Fortune magazine, to say like this is an important business initiative for us. So I feel like there is still a lot of work to be done, but I do feel like for us to not always feel like we need to fight, but how do we bring more people to the table to realize what the ultimate goal is? It's like we want to actually be better. We actually want to expand the table so more people can be seen, and we can actually do better in whatever it is our businesses are.
Perfect. I appreciate you saying naming and reframing. I think it's a topic that, with DEI especially, like right now, it's on the radar for a lot of companies, and some of them are just getting rid of them completely. Like we've seen Boeing, we've seen Lowe's. Several companies are now saying that it's not important, which leaves, I think, a lot of the employees feeling some type of way about that, especially those who are our color or historically marginalized groups. With that said, so because DEI continues to be scrutinized, and especially now with It's been happening now under Biden. It may happen again under Trump. For those that feel like they need to water down their DEI efforts, those companies, or just get rid of them completely, and I've already seen trends of this with some of my clients where they'll have their annual reports and they'll just either not have it mentioned at all in their annual reports, or they'll just rename it and reframe it, as you said, just because they do not want to get the backlash, which is unfortunate, but it's true. So from your opinion, or what you think, or in your experience, what could be the consequences of these shifts of organization culture and employee engagement if they continue to water down their DEI efforts or get rid of them completely?
I think it depends on how companies approach that. If companies are already using DEI as a performative way to talk about like inclusiveness or hiring practices or whatever, I think people eventually see through that anyways. And so I think if companies are really doing the work to understand what are the challenges that their specific employee population faces and how can they actively address that, that's really different than just the performative act of saying we have DEI and then like having nothing behind it. And I'll give an example at the company that I work with. We're a global multinational company. Our largest population of employees is in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, which struggles with public education for children. And so our company wants to keep these really great employees satisfied, happy, and able to plug into their job. And so offers them scholarships for their children to go to private school for the duration of their employment. This is life-changing for people, to pull them out of poverty, to pull them into a direction and focus on loyalty to a company. And it isn't a performative act around we're just recognizing a day or a month or something. It's like, I know this specifically is a gap that we need to fill as a corporation for our employees, to make sure that they feel satisfied, safe, and that their children are being helped into bettering their future. So I agree with Gary. We're going to see a lot of changes, as we've already seen with folks that are getting federal, state, local funding. I don't know how much any of us have control or influence, but I think corporations have a unique opportunity to step into the gap here and really put pen to paper and really understand, like, what does my employee need versus this performative act of like, well, we just have DEI, so we can say we have DEI, but we don't really do anything with it.
And I think, to your point, when we're performative, it's short term. It isn't sustainable. But I think, one of the things I do with organizations that I work with, and we simply talk about why it's important. I'll say, hey, what makes your team so successful and dynamic? And they'll always say we have different perspectives, skill sets, these backgrounds and expertise, right? That's diversity of skills. And when we have team members that need additional resources and support, what do? We do training and professional development and coaching and mentoring. Those are equitable actions. And we know that employees thrive and they want to stay at organizations in which they feel seen, heard, psychological safety, and a sense of belonging. Well, that's inclusion. And so, and when you talk about DEI being much more than just the right thing to do, we all know the business aspects. When you take diversity plus inclusion, it equals innovation and creativity that drives profitability, drives business success. And so I think a lot of it is really speaking the language in which our corporate leaders really are focused on. And yes, it is the right thing to do. It's the social responsible thing to do, but it is also the pillars that have made good business sense forever.
I'll add that eventually it'll be seen in business that your talent will go away. For those of you who are working for private companies right now, that I think there is a general happiness, if you will, that attrition rates are fairly low, right now, and part of it is because the market is terrible, in that regard. But that will open, and maybe, just given recent geopolitical changes, that will open, and I will dare to bet that some of the reasons that people will choose to seek other pastures is because of culture, because of how they are seen, their overall well-being, and it will impact businesses to a great degree. So there is work to be done, I think, in corporations to continue to maintain those culture factors, if you will, that really either allows people to stay or leave, in an organization Statistically, we know this. There was a study that came out over the summer for which Accenture was recognized. It was the Work Wellbeing 100. That was a study that was conducted by Oxford and partnered with LinkedIn that kind of looked at and measured these factors of well-being, and companies that did high, that rated real well. And this was an interesting study because they just interviewed employees without the knowledge of the employer. It wasn't a pay-to-play. It was just like, let's just go out there and interview employees and ask them about aspects of their well-being, which included a dimension of belonging, and said, how are you doing? And if they rated high, it actually matched the company's abilities to perform well on like say the Fortune 500, so to speak. Like they had higher revenues, higher profitability if their people were healthy and had greater well-being. I think when that gets eroded, you see the opposite happen as well. So I think that this is an important time, I think, for companies, despite all that's happening in the zeitgeist, to really pay attention to it. At the heart of everything, whether you make a widget or not, it's your people. And if they are not feeling seen, safe, connected, and thriving, then you're losing your asset.
I love that you're talking about the people that are working there, and working in DEI or being part of ERG, fighting the good fight constantly. It can be exhausting, especially if you're part of that marginalized community. And being, all of us are part of a marginalized community in some asset, right? So what do you do as a leader to? I feel like this is a very cheesy question, but it's real. Like, how are you practicing your self-care? I think all of us are feeling a moment of like our mental health is like being impacted, especially today with the results of the election. How are you practicing self-care as you're working in DEI and constantly fighting the good fight for so many folks who may never be at the table?
I think part of it is that, you have to have that good support system. You have to surround yourself with others that you can be authentic and transparent with. And unfortunately, many organizations, those that are leading DE&I efforts, are a team of one, right? And really, as you mentioned, taking that time for self-care is critical. Back in Michigan, where I come from, we have a couple of different roundtables of inclusion leaders in the space. And we come together and we talk about the challenges and best practices and ways in which we are able to really support one another, but also what are some of the resources and thoughts. And even as an individual leader within an organization, you have to have those confidants that you can go to and that you can be transparent with, because this is heavy. And when you're carrying the burden of so many others and doing this work that's very difficult to do, we can't show up and be our best selves for others if we're not taking care of ourselves first and foremost. And so I think when you talk about well-being, it is the complete well-being, physical, mental, financial, all of those aspects that we really have to be intentional in caring for ourselves first with.
I think for me, it's coming from a place of vulnerability and then boundaries. So being willing to talk about what I need in an authentic way, and then setting limits about what I am and am not capable of all the time. And that can be in a variety of different settings, but those are the two hallmarks for me to make sure that I am in a place that I can authentically self-care.
Plus one to what they shared, yes.
Okay, that's fair. I know we have only a few more minutes, like 10, 12 minutes. I don't know if anyone from the audience has any questions. I can look on this thing, but I don't know if anyone to speak up. If not, I can continue to ask you questions. Nothing? Oh, yes, go ahead.
I put a question in the chat, but as you all were talking and just kind of thinking even further, I'll say the question in the chat, but I don't think this is significant as I'll get into mine after.
Yeah, no, say speak your truth. What is it?
So I'm a co-chair on our LGBTQ ERG, and I'm very fortunate to work for an organization that highly invests in DEI. We have a council, we have a DEI coordinator, we have 4 ERGs, and the company really does care. The ERG is really focused on that. One of the things, which is the question I put in there, was just participation. That's the one thing we struggle with, is getting more employees. We have 8,000 employees across the country. The ERG probably has about 20 to 30 people that participate. But to come to actual meetings and engage, that's closer to maybe like 10, right? So do you have suggestions on increasing engagement and participation in those ERGs? That was the question I put in the chat.
I have thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So from my experience working with ERGs, I've noticed it's an extra labor of love. It's usually not compensated by any means. It's usually not something part of your review process. So you're not going to get promoted based on the work that you're doing in the ERGs. So I think that it should be more equitable if these groups are bringing like valuable information to the organization to help grow XYZ things. They should be compensated in some capacity. It doesn't actually have to be monetary. It could be in other ways, and also being part of their review process. I think that if they're adding value, they should get promoted based on that value they're adding. And I don't think that's always the case. Usually, it's an afterthought.
We're nonprofit, so we, budget-wise, we do have a DEI budget.
Mm-hmm.
We do events, we do a Pride event, and we do try to give incentives out. We do an award every year, so there are little things, but I think that's a great idea to brainstorm on further.
The other thought I had was leveraging other ERGs in your organization to amplify around issues that your community are interested in, but also bring in allies. So for example, financial health and wellness. There are some unique issues I think that are central to the LGBTQIA community, but partnering, say, with the African American ERG could be quite powerful. And guess what? Then you've amplified a whole, another set of allies who maybe, a bit more comfortable because they were brought to the table to, discuss an issue that was mutual. And there's intersections, of course, around the ERGs. I've seen that work effectively in our organization. And just the power of the collective, makes it seem, I think, more inviting, especially for people who are not part of the community, and maybe invite more who are in the community to say, hey, I want to learn about that topic, in that regard.
I love that idea. We did, so for Suicide Prevention Month, we did 2 listening circles, right, for the organization. And we collaborated to plan them, but we did them separately. And as you were speaking, I was like, why did we do that?
Yeah, it's
I
true.
just wanted to add one more thing to think about. When corporations add a lot of provisions that they offer to employees as benefits, they often get underutilized for a variety of reasons. They either don't have time, or they don't understand how the resource can benefit them. And so thinking about how can you bake in paid time for employees to participate as part of their job function. It's not something that's extra and on top of their existing workload. We have found to be very beneficial.
Those are all really good ideas.
And I was just going to also giving that space for recognition, that non-monetary recognition. We know that so many within our organizations really want to be a part of a purpose. And so I think really amplifying that to your point, and also giving exposure to all of the DE&I efforts, right? Just like any other critical strategic business function, spotlighting and making it a part of those town halls, making it something that senior leaders also amplify and share out. I think those things make individuals want to be a part of something that's greater than themselves.
Those were really good ideas. Not to monopolize, can I add one more question?
Okay, sure.
So as we're all are speaking, and obviously waking up this morning, my first thought is, are my rights as a human being going to be jeopardized? And I think a lot of us felt that as women, as persons of color, as a member of the LGBTQ+ community. So I immediately started pulling resources and sending them to my co-chair and saying, we gotta get these out, we gotta get these out. I just worry it's not enough. And can we do more? What else can we do? And I know that's a very loaded question. We have limited time, but if there are thoughts on that, I'd love to hear.
My vulnerability is telling me that I'm shell-shocked where you are.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I can do that question real justice by answering right now.
It's okay.
Yeah, I was going to kind of say the same. I think we're kind of a spot of, becoming centered with what the new reality is. And I think there is a great unknown. I think, though, as organizations, given that space for some of these brave conversations and these things that are on all of our minds, instead of running from it, we need to be able to, it's okay to not have answers, but I think it's important that we give space for people to really process, what they are dealing with individually.
Yeah, I think that's really important, that I think for fear of wanting to feel too separate, that we're not actually giving safe spaces to come together and just articulate, our vulnerabilities. I think that's an important place to start, and also grounding in reality. It's not, today our validation, our being, what we believe in, isn't gone. So there is still, I think, opportunity. It's perhaps the optimist in me because the alternative is rather disastrous at this point. But I still feel like there still is momentum, to be had towards positivity and inclusion.
Something that's really important as you guys were talking and then Heather was talking, and I say this maybe from the outside looking in as an ally to multiple groups, and there knows that we're going to through a lot of different journeys, but as you guys were talking about what we could do with this moment in time, what we could do with supporting our employees and members, it really resonated because I was sitting here thinking about our groups, and I said to them, can I come to that group? I'm with you, like, I didn't even think about it, right? But I also realized, like, having additional groups and looking at how we include equity and all of that, sometimes those things are extras, and I think as a company, we cannot just do this to say we're doing it. And so I thought about something that we did the other day that had a massive impact for Heather, and I didn't even know she was presenting, and I had a leadership team meeting at the same time, so just canceled the leadership team meeting and told them to go watch Heather. And I really think that it's a cultural change and being in a safe space, and it's less about a particular ERG group that you can attend because you identify here or you have this group, but how can you show up in your day-to-day operations of whatever company you're doing to support it, whether it's, one of our ERGs is just working with it because in our family, or, the LPG community, or we renamed our one group of Shay. Yes. And the thing is like, that's just a group, and I feel like sometimes we have the group who then almost inadvertently create a sideline. Right? So how are we embracing, and I think you said it really well, let's just not have a month on X. Even if it's suicide prevention or equal opportunity, let's have a month. Let's just have a year. Let's just have a day. Let's just let it be day-to-day.
Yeah.
And I think that day-to-day support is so important. I mean, I literally was in tears. Like, we had 30 extra people join my presentation out of the blue, and I was like, where'd you all come from? I don't know. No, I'm not kidding, but I'm just kidding. But like those little things I think are so important, and it's just hard. There aren't thousands of Beckys, but there are a bunch of allies that I think we've got to educate and raise so that they know how to support the rest of us. Right? I think so too, because it's an ally. I'm sitting here talking to our spot. I came because I was like, well, let's throw it down this morning. But I don't know why everyone else is in the room, and thank you for being here. But it's really, I'm going to say this with vulnerability. It's education to people like me to make sure I'm showing up and I'm pushing the right message so that these things are happening for him.
And I think part of being an ally can't be something that's mandated, right? It is something that can be a corporate directive, but it comes from an authentic place of curiosity. And I think that when we think about this, True North is really, when you talk about inclusion and equity efforts, it isn't this thing that we do. It's just who we are as an organization, how we show up internally to our team members, how we show up in our communities and our partners and key stakeholders. It's just, who we are. And it has to move beyond being that silo and that thing to being our culture.
Well, we have 2 more minutes, but there was a good question that was in the chat that I would like to propose to the group. What practical steps have you seen or would you recommend for being successful with facilitating open conversations about DEI with large groups of 100K people, 100,000 or more size organizations? Because being vulnerable is really important. Being at a nonprofit is different than being at like a huge, like in a center and having this conversation.
Something I observed that I thought was really effective was, I guess it spurred out of 2020, so right before I joined the firm, and the organization was wrestling with how to have these conversations when there were certainly, big groups of people who were just struggling with the realities of what was happening from a racial justice perspective, not to mention a pandemic and all of these other geopolitical issues, health issues, et cetera. And they started a series called Building Bridges. I think two key things about it was it wasn't a performative act of having a conversation. They took a very visible key leader in the organization, an executive who was a CEO, to facilitate the conversation, and they brought somebody external to challenge him on certain topics and have him show his own vulnerability, and he was willing to do that, which I thought was really amazing to do that. And it was a series of conversations that was organic, it was planned, so that any topics that were coming up in the organization that the people were concerned about, livelihood during the pandemic, what is the U.S. stance, after the murder of George Floyd, what are investments going to be, how are we going to continue to walk the talk, after everybody else decides to back away from the table. And I thought that was a very successful series, and it's now a model that anytime, not only when there are issues, but that there are moments of change happening in our organization all the time, and we leverage those times of conversation to bring those forward.
I think, too, we have to acknowledge that in corporate settings, there's power differentials happening. So bringing 100K people into a room to have an open and vulnerable conversation may not really be a reality, even if we want to think that it is. So how do we create some safe anonymity for people to bubble up real issues? And I like the idea that Tam mentioned for like outside consulting to come in and give kind of a top-down look in some ways, to give your executive team a clearer view on what's happening versus their impression of what is happening. And then a bottom-up way for people to anonymously and safely share concerns and challenges that they're having within the organization that somebody is accountable to be responsive to and potentially actionable for. So.
Perfect.
And just real quick, I was just going to say, there's not a magic event or silver bullet that's going to address. I think it has to be something that's ongoing, intentional, and utilizing multiple means and creating those environments for all to feel safe and to really be vulnerable. And that's the thing. We're all at different points of our journey, and recognizing that. And really recognizing that we all don't have the answers. And I love what you just shared with your senior leader, willing to be so vulnerable, because I think that's what inspires trust in our team members, to really see us and leaders be vulnerable and be willing not to have all of the answers as well.
Those are really great answers. I know we're at time, so we wanted to say thank you so much for attending this conference and letting us have this vulnerable, honest conversation about DEI and what's going to happen in the future. We'll just have to pray about it because I don't know, but here we are. Thank you all so much, and if you have any questions, feel free to come up, but the session's over. Thank you.